Trey. Good morning. It is September 11th, 2020. This is Turfgrass Team Times from the OSU Turf Team. Online this morning with Dr. Dave Gardner, Dr. Drs Shetlar, Joe Rimelspach and Pam Sherratt to talk about various issues that have arisen in the last 2 weeks. We are breaking out distances on these events now, so this will be the first one in September. The last one for the month will be somewhere around the last Friday of September. So if you're missing the vital information, then you're going to just have to wait. We are all back to school, and it has all the fun of the fair that you would expect in this current pandemic. However, on an agronomic front, we're going to take the lead from Dr. Dave Gardner.
Okay, so for our update this week, I figure it's been several years since the past palums encroached into Ohio, and so we need an exciting new grassy weed species to talk about. And a golf course superintendent has provided us with evidence of that. Here's a picture of the new grassy weed that we're going to get to concern ourselves with in Ohio. This is Japanese stiltgrass, Microstegium viminium. It's an annual. Now, what's interesting about this particular grass is that when you look at it, it kind of almost looks like a bamboo species because the leaf blades are really wide, and because of the growth habit of the grass, it just kind of has that more upright sort of appearance to it when it's growing in an unmowed environment. And so the first thing that you look at is you're like, kind of almost looks like a Phylostachys or some kind of miniature bamboo. But it's actually related to crabgrass. It's in the Panacoideae subfamily, and so it's an annual. Okay, this is an invasive species that was actually introduced in Tennessee in 1919, and it's just happened to take it this long to become a noticeable enough problem in Ohio that I'm starting to get people sending me emails with pictures that say, hey, what is this? In fact, a former OTF president, I was out taking data on one of my research plots, and he pulled up in his car. He was dropping off a sample of this for me to identify. And so I know that people are starting to see this, okay? Very coarse textured. It will survive repeated mowing. It's got a leaf blade. If you look at it, it's not so dissimilar to the past palums in that it's got the bright midrib and it's a very broad blade, but it's a little bit different in its growth habit in that it does develop more of an upright nature compared to the past palums. As far as control, since it's an annual, you can attempt to use pendimethalin, prodiamine, or dithiopyr. Prodiamine is the one most often recommended, but pendimethalin and dithiopyr should be effective as well. The trick is this germinates far earlier than crabgrass does, and so if you have a problem with this, don't go out in the middle of April with your pre and think that that's going to get the job done. You have to back that up about a month, which then is going to have ramifications if you have both this and crabgrass in your turf areas. You can also attempt post-emergence control, but if you do that, phenoxaprop is the one active ingredient that's known to have some activity. With phenoxaprop, if it's been a while since you've used it, remember that that's the compound that is weirdly deactivated by 2,4-D or MCPP, so you have to avoid application of that active within 3 weeks of either of those two, okay? But post-emergence control may be attempted with that particular active ingredient. Another new grass species that we're seeing in Ohio that's been in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana for a while, but we're now starting to get reports of it as well, is windmill grass, which is a species of chloris, which is actually more related to Bermuda grass or nimblewill. Now I'm showing you these familial relationships. You know, the first grass was related to crabgrass, the second grass is related to Bermuda grass because that offers us some evidence for control strategies. And my point with saying this is that just like with Bermuda grass and nimblewill, we don't have good options for pre-emergence control of those weeds. We also really don't with chloris either, okay? I don't have a picture of this for you. I've had a couple of emails from folks asking how to control it. If you want to look at an image of it, you can think of it as basically nimblewill if nimblewill grew about 6 inches tall and had a spike on it that looked like crabgrass, but with 6 spikes instead of 2 or 3. As far as control, though, post-emergence is the way to try to get rid of this. The specific combination of herbicides that's recommended is mesotrione, the high label rate, so 8 ounces per acre, combined with triclopyr at 32 ounces per acre. The combination of the two is rather important to get good control, plus a non-ionic surfactant, 2 applications 21 days apart. So hopefully these are not things that you're seeing widespread, but just like with the past palos back in 2012, I started yammering about how to control those, and you know, most people weren't really seeing those, and then over time it became a much more common, frequent occurrence. I would expect that these 2 grasses that I just talked about will become more common and frequent to occur in Ohio as well. The last thing that I wanted to mention real quick is if you had problems with winter annual broadleaf weeds last spring, this is the time to attempt to take care of them if you're going to do that with pre-emergence herbicides. I said this earlier in the year, but it bears repeating that pre-emergence control in September tends to be more effective than attempting to control with post-emergence in November, which is a much better option than if you try to control these after they become visible and a problem next spring. So if you had a problem with winter annual weeds last year or this spring, this is the time to go ahead and throw down a pre-emergence herbicide to attempt to not have that problem next year. All right, and so Ed, that is my presentation for today.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Gardner, much appreciated. You have continued to add to the woes of 2020 with 2 new pests that are going to come in and invade and wipe us out. Just thank you so much, sir. Okay, Dr. Dave Shetlar, what giant 10-legged insect is going to eat us by the toenails and kill all our grass?
Let's see. Let me share my screen also, and let's see here if I can get this thing to cooperate. Yep, there we go. What I'm hearing from primarily lawn care, but also sport turf managers and occasionally golf course superintendents about the sod webworms that are flying right now. There are 2 species that come out typically in September, usually the last week of August and the first 2 to 3 weeks of September. They're fairly large, flashy species. We just collectively call them the vagabond sod webworm. There's a larger species, this one over here that has more gray striping on it, and a smaller species. So this is called the vagabond sod webworm, and the smaller one is the lesser vagabond sod webworm. What's kind of unique about them is that no matter how much you've sprayed during the summertime for caterpillars, these seem to survive. And the reason for that is that these come out at this time, lay eggs, the larvae about half mature by November when they go down to overwinter. They finish their maturity in the springtime, but then they dig down in the soil and they form what we call an estivating. That's a summer hibernation pupal case. So they're not active during most of the summertime and thus avoid most of the summer insecticide treatments that should kill caterpillars. Nothing to worry about. I've never seen any actual damage from these because the larvae are most active when our turf is most actively growing. Now, some people are beginning to find grubs. We had a couple of good rains just this last week and maybe a little bit more this weekend. And that seems to have spurred on some of the white grubs to go ahead and finish their development. And what I wanted you to see is the difference between these 2 pictures. If you'll notice, this grub over here seems to be quite white, and that means that it's actively feeding. This one over here has got kind of what I call a buttery yellow color to it. And what that means is that it is converting its fat body to be able to overwinter. And so it's likely not feeding. And the reason for that is that if you do need what I call a rescue treatment to kill those big fat and sassy land shrimp stage white grubs, you do need to understand if they are still feeding, that means that they will ingest the insecticide. And believe it or not, if you still have some imidacloprid in the closet that you can use, that would be the cheapest material to use, but clothianidin and 7 would also work quite well if the grubs are actively feeding. If the grubs are not feeding, you need a contact insecticide. You need something that will contact the exoskeleton as you water it in, pass through the exoskeleton, and kill the grubs at that time. So our old familiar friend trichlorophon or Dilox, and then clothianidin, the Arena or Aloft product, and 7 all have contact toxicity capabilities, but in order for that contact toxicity to work, you really need to water it in. And this is always problematic with homeowners, trying to tell them how much water to apply. You really need at least a quarter of an inch, and you'll often see people recommending a half an inch of water, but anybody that knows irrigation systems, trying to get a half an inch of water is a pretty Herculean task. So I usually say at least a quarter of an inch, hopefully 3/8 of an inch, or if you can wait to apply this when you're expecting a rainfall event, that will also help. That's all I've got for my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Shetlar. So we've got some nice new terminology. We've got fat white grubs on a diet. We got vagabonds and estivating. Wow, what a day. The infamous Joe Rimelspach.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Well, I don't have anything too exciting here. As far as on the golf course side, dollar spot with these somewhat cooler temperatures and rainfall and heavy dews has just exploded. If you're not managing it or ahead of it, you'll know it by now. It's been quite aggressive. And so keep on top of that. Anthracnose, I just mentioned that we aren't getting many samples, but with cool temperatures, you can still have anthracnose. And especially with the heavy use on golf courses and wear and stress, anything that weakens the turf, especially poania, or even bent, you can have anthracnose moving in this time. So be on top of that, and you can check very carefully at the base of the plant for the little black spines to identify that or send a sample in. And then I just want to encourage you with the heavy use in golf courses and probably the heavy use on Saturdays, since there's not a lot of collegiate football, just be aware of, stick to the basics. Make sure you're mowing properly, good fertility, and the basics. Lawn side, I just want to mention a couple things there. Of course, rust is popping up. And if you do have the new seedings, oftentimes those juvenile plants can be quite sensitive to it. I've never seen rust wipe out turf. It can be more of a nuisance thing. Fertility oftentimes can help grow it out. And Pam's going to talk more about fertility later, which is very, very important in the fall to address that. The one thing, disease I do want to mention is there's been some talk about gray leaf spot. Now, gray leaf spot, we've mentioned this before, and to this point, this fall, I've gotten 0 confirmations of gray leaf spot. I've heard people say they think they have it. We look at pictures and samples. It's all common leaf spots, the Dreschlaria bipolaris, etc. Also, people say, well, we have it, and we see all this mycelium, this mold growing on the grass. If you see mold or mycelium, it is not gray leaf spot. It produces no mycelium. So that's one way to identify it. If you have collapsing ryegrass only and there's no mycelium, could be gray leaf spot. The key is you really have to look under a microscope to identify the spores. And with these cool down and temperatures we're having now, I think it's going to be very unlikely that that is going to be a culprit on many cases whatsoever. So if you have questions, let us know. The other thing on lawns is with some rain, pretty widespread now, you'll know what areas are alive or dead. And so there's probably going to be a need for a lot of renovation of the state. Again, check the crowns. If they're still alive, by now you may see some new growth, some new leaves, tillers from those crowns to see if you're going to get any potential recovery. And again, back to the basics on renovation. Last thing is samples. We are open. We have been pretty much all year. I still get people saying that they thought we were closed, but no, we are. We'll take samples, turf samples. I'll work on those. Joey at the lab is still doing trees and shrubs. If you have trees and shrubs, those go to the Reynoldsburg address. If you have turf, please contact me so I can get them on a timely basis and work with you. So if we can help in any way, feel free to contact us. But that's all I have, Ed.
Thank you, sir. Yes, some of those images about grey leaf spot did indicate there was mycelia, and I see 2 brown bands across the leaf tissue looking suspiciously more like dollar spot. Okay, the infamous sports turf guru, Pamela J. Sherratt.
Good morning, everybody. I'm sat on my porch and it's been a little noisy, so hopefully you can hear me. Just as a sidebar, I feed the blue jays in my neighborhood peanuts, and so they get a little noisy this time of the morning, so I apologize if it gets a bit hectic on my porch this morning. Okay, so as Joe was saying about rust, I actually went on my first fall extension visit last week, and the field was completely covered in rust. And the second indication I got that it might be a little hungry is that it wasn't just as green as it could be, and they weren't getting a lot of growth and recovery from the traffic that they had. It was a multi-use field that both football and soccer teams were playing on. So fall sports at the high school level is back in full swing. Some programs that have not got fall sports this year are looking at putting those back on in the spring, and so there will be a lot of traffic going on athletic fields this fall and continuing to do so, probably even very early in the spring. So typically where we've just had, you know, baseball, softball in the spring, we might even be hosting football and soccer games in the spring to make up for what they didn't do this fall. So traditionally, when we've looked at spring green up, how do we get fields ready for early spring? One of the big tools that we've used has been late season fertilizer. So this was a historic fertilizer application that went out, and it was typically around Thanksgiving. And the purpose of that late season fertilizer application was to, for those carbohydrates to be stored, for roots and rhizomes to be developed over the cooler early winter period, and then to have quick spring green up in the spring without the flush of growth. And we've kind of moved away from that in recent years because of the potential for an environmental no, we don't want leaching of that nitrogen, and we don't want that to affect water quality in any way if we do get leaching. So there's been several studies done around the United States, and I reached out to some of the cool season professors that have done some of this research. Dr. Soldat and Dr. Schlossberg have been really helpful this week on trying to put together a recommendation for Ohio. And a lot of the work's been done on golf greens, on sand, where there's a higher leaching potential. And that showed that really, once we get into the colder periods, we don't really get we only get about 25% nitrogen uptake once we start to get too cold in October and November, because the nitrogen uptake is directly related to the mass flow of water through the plant, through evapotranspiration, and also through diffusion. So that's based on the concentration gradient of nutrients in the soil. And those two are both driven by temperature. And so as our temperatures decline, the plants aren't taking that nitrogen up as much, and it's a waste of money, and that nitrogen could be leached and affect water quality adversely. And so what is the recommendation? Talking to Dr. Schlossberg at Penn State, and I think we're kind of on a similar vein as them. His recommendation is that usually around our frost date, which in Ohio last year I think was the 19th of October, we're typically steady on that frost date in Ohio as being the second or third week of October. He's recommending not going really past about a week after that. And you would put out a ½ pound of nitrogen, and you would use a slow release source. You wouldn't use, you could use a soluble nitrogen source, but you definitely would not put out more than a 0.3 or a 0.5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. So I think that's what we're probably going to go with. As a turf team, I think it would be pertinent for us to put out a little fact sheet or something like that on this topic, because, you know, for years and years and years, we've gone behind this late season fertilizer wrap, and the research is telling us now that that's not the way to go. And we can get a good turf response this fall, a great turf response next spring. We can do so in an environmentally friendly way by making that application no later than end of October with about ½ pound of N with a soluble source. So that's my recommendation for today, Ed, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. Not too controversial for the fertilizer salesman, right? One other thing to remind you on that fact sheet and ideas, for those of you looking at renovation information, Dr. Jane Roddenbush has an absolutely fantastic series of 5 different videos on our OSU YouTube turfgrass account. They are open to the public, so feel free to search for them. With that, we will let you go. We are still in the heavy stages of prepping for the OTF conference, so expect to see some information details on that in the very near future. The OTF golf outing is also coming up, so take part if possible, and the ATI golf event with the dunk tank is also going to have more information next week, so keep an eye out for that. With that, folks, we will let you go and say thank you so very much.